They called Eleanor convenient, and they said it smiling, as though a smile could turn a word soft that had never once been kind. She did not set down the tray of correspondence balanced against her hip. She did not glance toward the looking glass to see whether her face had betrayed her. She did not give the room the satisfaction of watching the word land. London, in the spring of 1816, kept its appointments regardless of whose composure was quietly failing inside them, and the morning room of the Ashworth townhouse on Berkeley Square went on being magnificent in the particular way of rooms that had never once considered the comfort of the woman standing in the middle of it. Ceilings frescoed with a triumphant, unrelated family history. A hearth built for a fire twice its size, tall windows that let in a great deal of light and warmed none of it toward her. Convenient, it was the word society had settled on for her marriage, the way a jury settles on a verdict it had decided before the evidence was ever heard, and it had followed her out of the church a year and a half ago and into every drawing room since. Worn smooth, now from repetition, no longer even meant to wound so much as to describe, which was somehow worse. Pinned at her collar, where a woman of consequence might have worn a diamond, sat a small brooch shaped like a wren, wrought in tin and cheap glass, one eye chipped pale, its wings scratched thin by 30 years under someone else's thumb, before they had come to rest under hers. It was the only ornament in the room that had not been chosen to impress anyone. On the writing desk beside her lay the quarterly ledgers from the Hampshire estate, their columns reworked in her own small, careful hand into a shape that would save the dukedom something near £1,100 a year. A fact that belonged, as far as the household understood it, to Mr. Prescott, the steward, who had signed his name beneath her arithmetic and been praised for his cleverness at dinner 3 nights running. No one in the room looked at the ledgers. No one looked at the wren. The clock on the mantel went on keeping time regardless, indifferent, as clocks generally are, to which hearts in a room have just been quietly broken. Lady Sybil Vane, the Duke's aunt by his late father's second marriage, occupied the good chair by the window as though it had been built expressly to receive her, and it was she who had said the word, turning it over with the pleasure of a woman handling a coin she meant to keep. "The dear Duchess is so wonderfully convenient," she said again, "to no one and to everyone. No fuss, no scenes, no demands. Julian is fortunate, really, that a girl of her background should turn out to want so little." The words sounded almost like praise. The insult folded inside them was aimed not at Eleanor's person, but at the arithmetic beneath her marriage, the trade connections on her mother's side, the money that had married a name, and everyone in the room understood the sum without anyone having to say it aloud. "You are too kind, my lady," Eleanor said, setting the tray down at last with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone watching could have guessed. "I have always thought wanting little was simply another way of not troubling to ask." It was not a denial. It was not an accusation either. It relocated the fault so quietly that Lady Sybil, sipping her chocolate, did not immediately notice she had been handed something to choke on, and by the time she did, the moment had already closed over it like water over a dropped stone. Her brother Thomas, seated nearer the fire with the particular ease of a man who had never once paid for his own coal, laughed the short laugh of someone changing a subject before it became a debt he might be asked to settle. "Wonderfully put, Nell," he said, using the childhood name he trotted out only when he wanted something softened. "You always did have a gift for turning the knife so gently no one feels it go in." He meant it fondly. The pressure underneath the fondness was not fond at all, and Eleanor had learned, in 18 months of marriage arranged to solve 2 families' problems at once, that Thomas's affection and Thomas's convenience had become, for him, the same word. Their father had died owing more than the family name could absorb, and it had been Thomas, 23 and frightened in a way he never let show, who had gone to the young Duke of Ashworth with the proposal that had saved them both, her dowry drawn from their mother's mercantile fortune, for the dukedom's crumbling roofs and mortgaged farms, the Ashworth name, older than anyone could quite remember, for a family whose money had grown faster than its pedigree. It had solved everything on paper. It had solved nothing that mattered in a marriage, and everyone concerned had known that from the very first handshake, though no one had said so, because saying so would have made the arrangement sound like what it was, rather than what it was called. A prettier name had been found for it, as prettier names generally are found for arrangements that would otherwise shame the people making them, and convenient was only the respectable coat that a colder truth had chosen to wear. Eleanor touched the wren at her collar without meaning to, the way her fingers had learned to do whenever the room grew too loud in ways no one else could hear. And for a moment, the frescoed ceiling and the too large hearth and Lady Sybil's satisfied silence all fell away into something smaller and warmer, and gone 11 years now, her mother's kitchen, the smell of yeast and lavender water, a chair by a low fire, rough wool under her cheek, where her mother's shawl had rested across her shoulders like a second, kinder pair of arms. Her mother had found the brooch at a market stall the week before she died, too poor by then to afford real gold, and she had pinned it to 8-year-old Eleanor's collar, with hands already thinning from the illness no one had named aloud yet, and she had said, in the voice Eleanor could still hear clearer than she could hear most people speaking to her now, "A wren doesn't sing to be seen, child. It sings because it can." She had not understood it then. She had spent a great deal of the 11 years since trying to. Not X, she had come to think. But Y? Not a performance for an audience that might never arrive, but a truth kept regardless of who was listening, and there were days, this being one of them, when the distinction felt like the only inheritance she had that no one could take a commission on. The room, unaware of any of this, moved on to the subject of the opera. It was to be Rossini that Thursday, a benefit performance, the sort of evening at which the entire fashionable world arranged itself in tiers like a garden arranged by height, and Lady Sybil wished to know whether the Duke intended the family box to be occupied, since boxes left dark reflected poorly on a house, whatever else might be true of the house in question. Eleanor said that she believed her husband did intend to attend. She did not say that she had learned this from the housekeeper rather than from him, 3 days after the arrangements were made, in the incidental way she generally learned most things concerning her own household. She did not say that the Duke had not, in fact, asked her whether Thursday suited her, because it had not occurred to either of them by now that such a question required asking. Julian Vane, Duke of Ashworth, was not a cruel man in any way the law could measure, and this was precisely what made him difficult to hold to account for the ways in which he was won. He had inherited the title at 26 4 years before Eleanor came into his life, finding beneath the coronet a set of estates so encumbered by his father's gambling that the family solicitor had used the word insolvency twice in one meeting without apparent embarrassment, and he had spent the years since building himself into precisely the kind of man such a discovery makes, exacting, controlled, feared in rooms where feared was a compliment, admired for a stillness that read, depending on the light and the observer, as either strength or ice. His voice never rose. It did not need to. Men twice his age went quiet when he entered a room, not from any single remembered cruelty, but from the accumulated weight of never once having caught him being careless, and women found him either irresistible or unreachable, sometimes within the same conversation, because his eyes gave away exactly as much as he intended them to, and not 1 degree more. Before the debts, before the solicitor's careful language, there had been another understanding, half-spoken and widely assumed, between the Ashworth heir and Cassandra Layton, then merely Cassandra Fitzwilliam, the loveliest and most self-possessed girl of her season, and the wreck of that understanding, quietly, efficiently buried under the wreck of the estate itself, was a fact that London had not forgotten even if the two people most responsible for burying it behaved, in public, as though it had never existed at all. Cassandra had married soon after, a colonel 20 years her senior who had obligingly died in Portugal, leaving her a fortune, a title of her own by courtesy, and a freedom that unmarried grief rarely permits. Widowhood suited her the way certain gowns suit only a particular woman, and she had returned to London 2 seasons ago with the settled, gleaming confidence of someone who considers a debt owed to her by fate and intends, eventually, to collect it. Eleanor had met her exactly 11 times since the wedding, and could have recited, from memory, the precise temperature of each encounter, each one a small architecture of admiring words built to house an insult too well constructed to answer. It was Cassandra who had once touched the wren at Eleanor's collar with 2 gloved fingers at a card party the previous autumn, and said, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, how charming, in its way, like something a child might make, out of nothing. Because nothing was all there was to work with. The room had laughed, not unkindly exactly, the particular indulgent laugh reserved for wit delivered by someone with the standing to be forgiven for it, not universal laughter, but enough. Eleanor had smiled and said that she had always found nothing a very honest place to begin, which was more than could be said for some inheritances. And the laugh that answered her had been thinner, uncertain whether it was allowed to exist at all, and Cassandra's eyes had gone cold in the particular way of a woman recalculating an opponent's worth upward against her will. That night, walking home behind her husband's silence in the carriage, Eleanor had thought, not for the first time, that she could compile, if she ever chose to, a whole catalogue of things she might have said instead, sharper things, truer things, things that would have taken the smile off several faces permanently, and that the withholding of them was the only power available to a woman whose name had been purchased rather than chosen. It did not feel like power most days. It felt like swallowing stones, but she had promised herself, dressing that morning in front of the glass with her mother's wren, catching what little light the room allowed, that she would tell Julian the whole of it, the card party, the years of small cuts delivered under cover of manners, the fact that she was tired in a way sleep did not touch, tonight, or some night soon, once he seemed less occupied, once the moment presented itself without her having to force it into being, because forcing things into being was not a skill her upbringing had thought to give her. Tonight kept arriving and finding her silent. It was 2 days after the exchange in the morning room. On a Tuesday, she would afterward remember with unwanted precision that she came down the back stair toward the library to return a book and heard her husband's voice through the door left carelessly ajar, low and even, addressed to Lord Ashby, his oldest friend and the closest thing he possessed to a confessor. She had not meant to listen, she told herself so twice, standing very still with the book pressed against her ribs like something that might otherwise fall and shatter. And then she listened anyway, because the alternative was walking away with the sentence half heard and letting it finish itself, unsupervised, in her imagination for the rest of her life. She won't make a scene, Ashby, Julian was saying, and there was nothing cruel in his tone, which was somehow the worst part, nothing raised or careless, only the flat, considered certainty of a man discussing an asset he had already appraised and filed. She never does. That's rather the point of her. Ashby said something Eleanor didn't catch, a question perhaps, and Julian's answer came back level as a closed ledger. It isn't unkindness. It's simply manageable, A wife who understands the terms doesn't require managing at all. She did not remember walking away from the door. She remembered later standing in the corridor with the book still held to her ribs and the wren brooch under her thumb, and she remembered thinking, in the flat, clear voice she used for facts too large to feel all at once, that she had just been told, by the one man whose good opinion she had quietly and stupidly gone on hoping for, exactly what she was to him, not a wife so much as a term that had been met. She did not cry. She had never once cried where it could be witnessed, and she was not about to begin in a corridor with a housemaid's footsteps approaching from the stairs. She went up to dress for dinner instead, and dressed carefully and said nothing, because tonight, again, did not seem to be the night. And she was beginning to understand, no shortage of reasons a woman could invent for why tonight was never quite the night. By the following evening, the household had turned its full attention toward Thursday and the opera, as though the sentence Eleanor had overheard belonged to some other woman's marriage entirely. And by Thursday itself, the whole apparatus of a fashionable engagement had assembled itself with the smooth, indifferent competence of a machine that did not know or care what it was grinding through on its way to producing an evening's entertainment. The King's Theatre stood ablaze that night with a warmth that flattered everyone standing beneath it and meant nothing at all. Gaslight pouring gold across velvet and jewels and bared shoulders, the great curved sweep of boxes rising tier upon tier like a garden built to be looked at rather than lived in, every face turned faintly toward every other face in the particular vigilant courtesy of people who had come as much to be seen enduring pleasure as to feel any. Eleanor arrived later than the rest of the party, delayed by a torn hem that had required 10 additional minutes and a maid's hurried needle, and she came up the crimson-carpeted stair alone, in pale gray silk that asked nothing of the room's attention and received none, the wren pinned once more at her collar where the Ashworth sapphires, locked in their case at home, might have gone if she had thought herself entitled to wear them without being asked. She reached the family box a little out of breath, already composing the small, practiced smile she kept in reserve for arriving anywhere late, and the smile did not survive contact with what she found there. Cassandra Layton sat in the Duchess's chair. She sat in it the way a woman sits in a chair she has decided already belongs to her, spine easy, one gloved hand resting on the velvet rail exactly where Eleanor's hand had rested at every performance since her marriage, her profile turned toward the stage with the serene, unhurried confidence of someone who has never once had to wonder whether she was welcome anywhere. Julian sat beside her. He did not rise when Eleanor appeared in the box's narrow doorway. He turned his head, and his face, in the gaslight, gave away exactly as much as he had ever allowed it to give away, which was nothing at all, and for one endless, airless second the whole theater seemed to hold itself perfectly still, the way a held breath holds a room, waiting to see what the Duchess of Ashworth would do with the ruin of her own seat. She did not gasp, she did not retreat, she did not let her face answer the question the room was so eagerly asking of it. "Forgive me," she said, and her voice, when it came, was even and clear and pitched to carry no further than it needed to. "I appear to have arrived to find the box already so pleasantly occupied. I shall not trouble to disturb the arrangement." It was not a question. Cassandra's smile widened, warm and public and utterly without warmth, and she said something about the Duchess being, as ever, so wonderfully understanding, so easy, so little trouble to accommodate, and the words sounded almost admiring, the way a compliment sounds when it has been sharpened on one side and handed over blade first. The pressure underneath them was not admiration at all. Eleanor understood, standing in that doorway with several hundred eyes beginning to find her. that she had reached the end of a road she had been walking without quite admitting where it led, that she was not enduring a marriage any longer so much as deciding, in this single suspended moment, whether she intended to go on enduring it in front of witnesses for the rest of her natural life. She did not look at her husband again. She turned instead, unhurried, and walked back out through the narrow door into the corridor beyond the tier, her chin level, her hands steady at her sides, her mother's wren catching the gaslight once, briefly, like something small refusing to apologize for the size of itself. What happened next was not, strictly, her doing, and she would spend a long while afterward trying to understand it as anything other than accident. A woman near the front of the adjoining box, Lady Marchmont, whom Eleanor barely knew, whose husband sat on 3 of the same charitable boards as Ashworth's man of business, rose first, gathering her shawl with the unhurried finality of someone who has simply decided the performance has ended early for her personally, and said to no one in particular, and to everyone, that she found she had a headache after all. Another woman rose behind her. A third followed before the second had reached the door, and then it was no longer 3 women, but a whole ragged, murmuring tide of silk and feathers and lowered voices moving toward the corridor, husbands trailing bewildered and half amused in their wake, until the entire tier that housed the family boxes had emptied itself in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, a slow, deliberate, unmistakable exodus that no one had organized, and everyone somehow understood. The orchestra, unaware or indifferent, did not stop playing. No thunder broke over the theater. No curtain fell early to mark the occasion as the catastrophe it plainly was for at least one person in the building. The soprano continued into her second aria as though nothing whatsoever had shifted in the architecture of the room above her, and this, more than anything that had been said in the box itself, was the detail Eleanor would carry longest, that the world simply continued. Indifferent and gleaming, exactly as it had continued through every smaller humiliation before this one, because the world's cheerfulness had never once required her cooperation to keep functioning. She did not weep in the corridor. She did not faint, did not tremble visibly, did not clutch at the nearest sympathetic arm the way the melodrama of the moment might have suggested she should. She stood very straight with her back against the cool plaster wall, while Lady Marchmont and a dozen women she had exchanged perhaps 40 words with in total across a year and a half of marriage arranged themselves loosely around her, discussing the quality of the soprano's upper register as though that, rather than anything else, were the evening subject, extending her the specific. Deliberate mercy of behaving as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. It was, Eleanor understood with the strange clarity of shock, the kindest thing several dozen strangers had ever done for her, and kindness of that particular unbought kind was rare enough in her experience that it landed with the force of something far larger than its size. She thanked Lady Marchmont for the headache remedy she did not need. She accepted an arm down the stair she did not require assistance descending. She climbed into her own carriage at last, alone, and only once the door had shut and the horses had begun to move did she allow herself the single, silent luxury of pressing 2 fingers hard against her mouth, not to hold back tears exactly, though there were some, but to hold in place the sentence that had been building behind her ribs since the corridor of the townhouse 2 nights before. I am not a term you have met, because saying it aloud to an empty carriage would have accomplished nothing, and she had promised herself, dressing that morning with the wren catching the light, that the next time she said it would be to the one person who needed to hear it, and it would not be tonight. Above her, in the box she had left, Julian Vane sat very still for a long moment after the door had closed behind his wife's gray silk, and if anyone had remained in the box to witness his face in that moment, no one did. Cassandra was already speaking, already smoothing the evening back into shape with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this before. They might have seen something move briefly behind the composed, unreadable surface he had spent 4 years constructing, there and gone again before it could be named, the way a fish turns once beneath dark water and is lost to the eye that was watching for it. He said very little for the remainder of the performance. Cassandra, twice, asked him a question that required more than a syllable in answer, and received only the syllable. By the time the carriages were called, he had grown, by the small, precise degrees only someone watching very closely might have registered, quiet in a way that was not his usual stillness at all, though there was no one present who knew him well enough, or watched him closely enough to notice the difference, and he offered no explanation to anyone, then or in the days that followed, for exactly what he had intended that evening, or what, if anything, he had expected his wife to do about it. London talked of little else for the better part of a fortnight. In the delighted, faintly cannibalistic way, London always discussed a scandal that had happened to someone else, and the talk divided itself, broadly, into 2 unequal camps, the larger one holding that the Duchess had behaved with remarkable composure for a woman of her modest origins, as though composure under public humiliation were an accomplishment roughly on par with a fashionable education, and a smaller, quieter one, gaining ground by inches at every card table and morning call, that wondered aloud, and then less aloud, and then simply among themselves in the particular hush reserved for opinions not yet safe to voice at volume, whether the Duke of Ashworth had not perhaps miscalculated rather badly in a wife he had married for her money, and continued evidently to underestimate for everything else. Eleanor heard both versions, filtered back to her through Lady Frances Calloway, the one friend in London whose affection had never once required anything of her in return. Over tea a week after the opera, in the small sitting room Eleanor had claimed for her own, within the vast, unwelcoming house. "They're calling you the woman the whole tear followed out," Frances said, not unkindly, turning her cup in her hands with the particular teasing patience she reserved for subjects Eleanor was reluctant to discuss. "Do you know what that means, Nell?" "It means, for the first time since your wedding, they are not calling you convenient." Eleanor said nothing to that for a moment, because there was, admittedly, nothing safe to say, and Frances, who had known her since they were girls too young to understand the size of the debts their families would eventually ask them to help pay, watched her with the frank, patient eyes of someone who had already worked out the truth and was simply waiting to see whether her friend would catch up to it herself. "He hasn't spoken of it," Eleanor said finally. "Not one word. Frances, not that night, not since. He came home, and he went to his study, and the household proceeded exactly as it always proceeds, as though nothing at all had happened above the second violins. That," said Frances, setting down her cup with the small definitive click of a woman delivering a verdict she had been sitting on for some time, "is not the silence of a man who felt nothing. I have known Julian Vane a great deal longer than you have, my dear, and I promise you, a man who felt nothing would have said something charming and forgettable at the first opportunity, simply to close the subject. He hasn't closed it. He's carrying it somewhere he thinks no one can see." She rose to leave shortly after, gathering her gloves with the unhurried grace of a woman who knew precisely how much truth to leave hanging in a room before it curdled into something less useful, and at the door she paused, glancing back at Eleanor with an expression that was equal parts affection and exasperation. "You are the only woman of my acquaintance," she said, "who could be humiliated in front of 400 people and spend the following week worrying about everyone's comfort but her own. One day, Nell, you are going to have to let yourself want something out loud." She left on that, as she always left, on an observation Eleanor could not immediately rebut, and the room settled back into its ordinary quiet, and Eleanor sat a long while with her tea going cold, turning the sentence over the way she turned the wren brooch under her thumb in idle moments, testing its edges for a truth she was not yet ready to hold up to the light. It was some days after this that the small, strange shift began, so gradual at first that Eleanor did not trust her own observation of it, the way one does not trust the first mild evening of a season that has been cold for months. Julian began appearing in rooms he had no particular reason to enter. He asked, at breakfast, a question about the Hampshire tenants that only someone who had actually read the ledgers rather than merely signed beneath them could have thought to ask. And when Eleanor answered it, more fully and more precisely than the question strictly required, he did not look away or change the subject, as he had done on perhaps 100 earlier mornings. He watched her a moment longer than politeness demanded, something moving behind the flat, guarded surface of his eyes that she could not name, and told herself firmly not to hope about. He was there, unexpectedly, at a musical evening she had not known he intended to attend, standing near enough that she felt rather than saw him for the better part of an hour, saying almost nothing, watching with the same unreadable stillness he brought to everything, except that twice, when Lady Sybil offered one of her softly poisoned compliments in Eleanor's direction, he answered before Eleanor could, in a voice so dry and level that it took the room a moment to register it as a rebuke at all, and Lady Sybil did not attempt a third. It was not tenderness. Eleanor was careful, turning the evidence over afterward in the privacy of her own mind, not to call it tenderness, because tenderness was a large word, and what she was watching, if she was watching anything real at all, and not merely the shape of her own hunger projected onto a careful man's careful silences, was smaller than that, and slower, and entirely without guarantee. It looked, if it looked like anything, like, notice, the particular, deliberate attention of a man who had spent a year and a half filing his wife under a single flat word and had recently, without explanation, begun to suspect the filing had been wrong. Not admiration, she told herself, lying awake with the wren set carefully on the table beside her bed, where the last of the candlelight could reach it. Not yet, only the beginning of a man looking properly, for what might have been the first time, at something he had assumed, for far too long, he had already finished appraising. The weeks that followed the opera did not resolve themselves into anything so simple as reconciliation, but they did not return, either, to the flat, indifferent silence that had governed the first 18 months of Eleanor's marriage, and she learned to read the difference the way a sailor learns to read weather, too subtle for a landsman to notice at all. Julian began to seek her out at hours that had no obvious use for her company. He would appear in the library while she worked through the Hampshire correspondence, not to supervise her, as Prescott sometimes did with a steward's proprietary anxiety, but simply to sit near the window with a book he rarely turned the pages of, and ask, eventually, some question about a tenant's roof or a disputed boundary hedge that proved, on examination, he had already read her notes on the subject and merely wanted to hear her explain them aloud. Eleanor answered these questions fully, because half-answers had never been her instinct, and she noticed each time the particular stillness that came over him while she spoke. A listening so complete it verged on something she did not yet trust herself to name. Not admiration, she told herself again, turning the thought over as carefully as she turned the wren beneath her thumb. Not yet. Only a man beginning, by careful degrees, to audit an account he had once closed without reading. It was at Lady Marchmont's ball, 3 weeks into this slow, wordless thaw, that the shift became visible to more than Eleanor alone. Cassandra had arrived in a gown the precise blue of a robin's egg, laughing at something a young officer had said with the bright, carrying laugh of a woman who intends to be heard across a room, and when she drifted near enough to Eleanor to be civil, she offered, in the same warm, solicitous voice she used for every cruelty she had ever delivered, the observation that the Duchess looked tired. Was everything quite well at home? There had been such stories lately. One did worry. The words sounded like concern. The concern had a blade folded inside it, aimed precisely at the still fresh scandal of the opera. And the room, sensing blood in the water the way rooms always sense it, thinned its conversation by half to listen for what would follow. Eleanor opened her mouth to relocate the fault, as she had relocated 100 faults before it, gently, humbly, in the practiced coin of her own restraint. She did not get the chance to spend it. "My wife," Julian said, arriving at her elbow with no apparent haste, and yet somehow occupying the exact moment the room needed him to occupy, "has never once required your concern, Mrs. Layton, and I confess I find it strange that you should extend so much of it toward a household you no longer have any standing to inquire after." His voice did not rise. It never needed to, but something in its flatness carried further than shouting would have, and the room, which had been leaning in for a wound, found itself instead witness to a rebuke delivered with the surgical economy of a man who had decided, finally, which side of a line he intended to stand on. Cassandra's smile did not waver, quite, though something behind it recalculated with visible effort. And she murmured something about having only meant kindness before withdrawing toward the card room with the unhurried dignity of a woman choosing to retreat rather than admitting she had been driven back. It was not a large moment, measured against the scale of the injuries that had preceded it. It was, Eleanor thought, walking home in the carriage with her husband's silence beside her, the first time in a year and a half that he had spent any part of his considerable social capital on her behalf without being asked, and she found she did not know what to do with the warmth that rose in her chest at the memory, except to press it down carefully, the way she pressed down everything too large to display, and wait to see whether it would be repeated or had simply been an anomaly, a single unrepresentative entry in an otherwise unbroken ledger. It was repeated. Not loudly, and not often enough to draw comment from anyone but Frances, who noticed everything and said so with her customary lack of tact over their next tea, but often enough that Eleanor began, cautiously, the way one tests ice before committing one's full weight to it, to let herself believe the pattern was real. He asked her opinion at dinner, in front of guests, on a matter of estate policy, and did not merely nod through her answer, but argued 2 points of it, with the genuine engagement of a man who expected to be, on occasion, wrong. He found her once in the estate room past midnight, unable to sleep, working through a dispute over drainage rights that Prescott had declared insoluble, and instead of sending her to bed, as propriety and his own long habit might have suggested, he pulled a chair to the opposite side of the desk and worked the problem alongside her until nearly 2. And somewhere in that hour she caught him watching her work through a column of figures, with an expression she could not fully read, though it was nothing at all like the flat, appraising look he had once worn appraising a marriage contract, and when she finally set down her pen he said, quietly, that Prescott had presented the tenant restructuring as his own idea 8 months ago, and that he had believed him. He did not apologize for the belief. Eleanor noted, filing the omission away without comment, that a man who had spent 4 years training himself never to be careless would find apology a difficult muscle to locate on short notice, and that this, too, was a kind of information worth having. What he did instead was quieter and, she thought afterward, more telling. He began, without announcement, routing certain decisions through her directly rather than through Prescott, small at first, a question about seed corn, a query about a widow's cottage in need of a new roof, and then larger, until the household, watching from its own vantage of servants' hall gossip and observed habit, began to understand, before either principal party had said a single explicit word about it, that something in the marriage had quietly, irreversibly begun to turn. "A wren doesn't sing to be seen," her mother's voice reminded her, on the nights this new attention frightened her more than the old indifference ever had. Because attention, once granted, could always be withdrawn again. And indifference at least had the virtue of being a floor rather than a ledge. It sings because it can. Eleanor was still turning that inheritance over, still deciding what it cost her to believe it applied to more than needlework and patience, when the letter arrived that changed the shape of everything else in the house. It came not to her, but to Mr. Grantham, the family's solicitor, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, some 6 weeks after the opera, delivered by hand and unsigned, and it took him the better part of a day to determine that its contents were serious enough to require bringing directly to the Duke rather than filing among the usual correspondence a solicitor absorbs and answers without troubling his client. The letter alleged, in a hand disguised just enough to suggest its author understood the risk of being traced, that the Duchess of Ashworth had for some months been diverting estate funds, small sums at first, growing steadily larger, into the accounts of her brother Mr. Thomas Hale, whose gambling debts in certain less reputable establishments off St. James's had, the letter claimed, grown considerably beyond his means to settle honestly. Enclosed with the letter was a single copied page, purportedly reproduced from the Hampshire ledgers, showing an entry in a hand meant to resemble Eleanor's own, recording a payment of £200 to T. Hale on a date some 5 weeks past, an entry that existed nowhere in the true ledgers Eleanor herself maintained and had never once seen before that morning. The letter's final line, the one Mr. Grantham read aloud to Julian with visible discomfort in the privacy of the study, suggested that unless the matter were addressed quietly and to the satisfaction of certain interested parties, it would be laid before the ecclesiastical courts as grounds for a formal separation, with the ledger page offered as evidence not merely of theft, but of a wife who had married a fortune and set about quietly bleeding it for the benefit of a family whose own insolvency had made the marriage necessary in the first place. "It was not," Grantham said carefully, watching his employer's face for some reaction he did not find, an accusation that could simply be ignored. A whisper of theft against a duchess, even an unproven one, would be enough to poison every drawing room in London within the fortnight, and a formal proceeding, however unlikely to succeed, would drag the Ashworth name through precisely the kind of scandal the dukedom had spent 4 careful years recovering from. Julian read the letter twice in silence, and then read the ledger page a 3rd time, and Eleanor, summoned to the study an hour later and shown both documents without preamble, felt the floor of her carefully rebuilt composure give way beneath her all at once, not because the accusation was true, but because she understood, reading it, precisely how completely it could ruin her whether it was true or not. She did not weep. She had promised herself, dressing in front of her mother's brooch on 100 difficult mornings, that she would not weep where it could be witnessed, and she held to the promise now with a discipline that cost her more than anyone in the room, even Julian, watching her with an unreadable stillness she could not afford to interpret, could have guessed. "I have never written that entry," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I have never taken a shilling of this house's money that was not accounted for to the farthing, and I have never given my brother anything he did not already know to ask his own conscience about first." It was not a denial delivered with tears. It was a fact stated plainly, the way she stated all facts too large to feel entirely at once, and Julian, watching her across the width of his own desk, said nothing for a long moment that felt, to Eleanor, like the whole of her marriage balanced on a blade's thin edge. "I believe you," he said finally, and the words landed with an unexpected weight, quiet and absolute, offered without qualification or demand for proof, and it was the first time in 18 months that he had given her anything without first calculating what it would cost him. It was not, Eleanor would think later, quite enough on its own to undo 4 years of a man's careful training in withholding himself. But it was, she thought, a beginning worth more than she had words for yet. Word of the accusation, despite Grantham's discretion, did not stay contained for long. Scandal in London moved the way water moves through a house with a cracked foundation, finding every seam, whether or not anyone intended it to. And within 3 days, Thomas arrived at Berkeley Square in a state of undisguised panic. His own debts, real ones, though smaller and less criminal than the letter implied, suddenly a matter of urgent, terrified concern to a man who had never once, in Eleanor's memory, shown urgent concern for anything that was not his own comfort. "I never asked you for £200, he said, pacing the length of the morning room with his hat still in his hands. "I never asked you for anything beyond what was arranged at the start. Nell, you must believe that. Whoever wrote this thing means to ruin us both, and I cannot for the life of me think who would trouble themselves." Eleanor believed him, mostly, though she noted, with the flat clarity she reserved for facts too uncomfortable to soften, that her brother's alarm was rooted rather more in what the accusation might cost him socially than in any particular horror at what it accused his sister of. And she found, turning the observation over, that she was no longer entirely surprised by this, only tired in the specific, bone-deep way of a woman who had spent her whole life being someone else's convenience and had only recently begun to notice the shape of the debt. It was into this house, thick with fear and unspoken accusation, that the Dowager Duchess arrived unannounced 2 days later, having heard the news from a correspondent faster than any of the family had thought to write to her themselves, and her arrival changed the temperature of every room she entered before she had said a single word. Honoria Vane, Julian's grandmother and the last surviving Duchess of Ashworth from the generation before his father's ruin, was a small, straight-backed woman well past 70, whose reputation for tart, unanswerable pronouncements had outlived 3 husbands' worth of London seasons, and she came into the morning room still in her traveling cloak, waved off the footman attempting to take it from her, and fixed Eleanor with a look so direct it felt, after weeks of veiled glances and folded meanings, almost shockingly honest. "Well," she said, "and I suppose everyone in this house has already decided you did it, have they, before anyone thought to ask you a single question?" "No one has said so outright, ma'am," Eleanor said carefully. "They have simply been very careful not to say the opposite." "That," said the Dowager, settling into the best chair with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her right to the best chair in any room she entered, "is precisely what people do when they have already decided something shameful and lack the courage to own it. I have known you 18 months, child, and I have watched you balance a household budget that would have broken lesser women's spirits without once complaining of it to anyone who might have thought to thank you. I did not need to see a forged ledger page to know you had nothing to do with it. I needed only to remember which of the 2 women currently circling my grandson's house has ever, in her whole recorded history, wanted anything she could not simply take. She did not, notably, say Cassandra's name aloud, not yet, but the room understood her meaning well enough, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since the letter's arrival, something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she was holding so tightly. "You believe me," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I believed you the moment I heard the accusation," the Dowager said, with the brisk, unsentimental certainty of a woman who considered belief in a person's character a matter settled by observation rather than evidence, which is a rather different thing from proving it, and proof, my dear, is what we are going to need if we mean to put this business to bed before it does you real harm. It was Honoria, in fact, who suggested, over the ledger page itself, spread flat on the study desk 2 evenings later, under a branch of candles, with Julian, Grantham, Francis, and a still-shaken Thomas gathered around it in a loose, anxious circle, that the true forgery, however carefully rendered, would almost certainly have failed to account for some small, habitual detail too minor for a stranger to think to counterfeit, and it was Eleanor herself, staring down at the copied entry until the letters blurred, who found it first. "My sevens," she said slowly, and something in her voice made every head in the room turn toward her at once. "Look at the sevens." She drew one on a scrap of paper beside the forged page for comparison, the small, deliberate crossbar through the stem that her mother had taught her as a girl, a habit inherited from a governess trained on the continent and passed down like the bruch itself, present in every column of every ledger Eleanor had touched in 18 months of marriage. The forged entry's sevens carried no crossbar at all, plain and unremarkable. Exactly the way any ordinary Englishwoman unfamiliar with Eleanor's particular habit might have written them without a second thought. "There it is," Grantham said quietly, bending close, and there was real relief in his voice, the relief of a solicitor who had spent 3 days dreading a case he could not have won. "Whoever copied your hand copied the shape of your letters and missed the one detail that makes them yours. It was not, on its own, quite proof enough to satisfy a court, and everyone in the room understood as much, but it was the loose thread Honoria had promised, and pulling at it unraveled the rest with a speed that surprised even Grantham. The date on the forged entry, checked against the household's own diary, fell precisely on the night of the opera. The very evening the entire fashionable world had watched Eleanor walk out of her own box in front of 400 witnesses, and remain, thereafter, in full public view at Lady Marchmont's own house until well past midnight. A fact half the ton could attest to without being asked twice, since it was, after all, the single most discussed evening of the season. A woman who had spent that night mortified in front of half of London could not, by any accounting of hours, have also spent it quietly forging entries into an estate ledger locked in her husband's own study. And the very evening that had once seemed the cruelest of Eleanor's humiliations turned out, in the end, to be the one piece of testimony that no one in London could credibly dispute on her behalf. "It appears," the Dowager said, with the dry satisfaction of a woman watching a plan she had suspected all along confirm itself, "that whoever wrote this letter forgot that half the city was busy watching my granddaughter-in-law suffer in public that same night. One does hate to see cruelty go entirely to waste, but there is a certain justice in cruelty proving its own author a fool." There remained the question of the stationery itself, and it was Honoria again, turning the original letter over beneath the candlelight with the particular squint of a woman who had read 4 decades of London correspondence and forgotten none of it, who noticed the faint watermark pressed into the corner of the page, a small, distinctive maker's mark belonging to a stationer on Bond Street patronized, as it happened, by a fairly narrow circle of fashionable women, one of whom the Dowager had watched, not 2 months prior, sealing an invitation with paper bearing the identical mark. She did not say the name aloud in front of Thomas, whose nerves, she observed dryly, were clearly fragile enough without additional excitement, but she said it to Julian alone, later that night, in the study with the door closed, and Eleanor, waiting in the corridor with her hand pressed flat against the door, for reasons she could not entirely have explained, heard her husband's voice come back low and very controlled, the particular flat calm he wore. She was beginning to understand, precisely in the moments when a louder man would have shouted. Whatever passed between them in that room, he emerged from it a changed degree, colder toward Cassandra Layton than he had been even after the opera, though he made no public accusation, brought no charge, staged no scene that might have handed London a second scandal to feast on where the first had barely finished cooling. He simply, over the following days, withdrew every remaining thread of acknowledgement he had ever extended her, declined the invitations that would have placed them in the same room, and let the silence itself do the work that shouting never could have. A restraint the Dowager observed with visible approval, and Eleanor found, watching it unfold, more unsettling than any outburst would have been, because it told her something about the man she had married that she had not fully let herself believe until she saw it, that his stillness, when he chose to weaponize it, was not the absence of feeling at all, but its most disciplined possible expression, the formal accusation, without evidence to support it, and with half the ton now quietly aware that the Duchess's alibi was unimpeachable, dissolved within the week into the particular kind of forgotten scandal that London specializes in producing and then abandoning, replaced almost immediately by fresher gossip that had nothing to do with the Ashworths at all, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since her wedding, walking through drawing rooms that regarded her not as convenient nor even quite as scandalous, but as something closer to formidable, a word she turned over privately with an unfamiliar, cautious pleasure she was not yet ready to trust completely. It was Frances, calling the following afternoon with a bouquet of hothouse violets and an expression of undisguised satisfaction, who put into words what Eleanor had not yet allowed herself to say aloud. "You do understand," she said, settling into her usual chair with the ease of long habit, "that he defended you before he had proof. Before the sevens, before the date, before any of it. He looked at that letter, and he believed you, on the strength of nothing but knowing you, Nell. And men like Julian Vane do not spend belief so freely on people they consider merely convenient." Eleanor said nothing to that for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly in its saucer, because there was, admittedly, no safe answer that did not require admitting more than she was ready to admit even to Frances, even to herself, in the clear light of an ordinary afternoon. She had not yet told him what she had overheard through the library door on that Tuesday 2 months past, the sentence about manageable wives and terms already met that had sent her out into the corridor, with her whole understanding of her marriage rearranged around it. She had promised herself she would say it, someday, when the moment presented itself without her having to force it into being, and the moment, true to its habit, had not yet presented itself, though she was beginning to suspect, watching the weather turn heavy and gray against the windows as the season wound toward its close, that it would not wait much longer to be forced. The Dowager returned to the country within the fortnight, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, but not before drawing Eleanor aside on her last morning in London and delivering, in the brisk, unsentimental voice she reserved for truths she considered too important to soften, the closest thing to counsel she had offered since her arrival. "He will not say it to you outright," she said, fastening her traveling cloak with quick, economical movements. Men of his particular training rarely do, not until they are given no other choice left to hide behind. But I have watched my grandson conduct himself through a great many difficulties in his life, my dear, and I have never once, in 4 years, seen him spend himself the way he spent himself defending you this month. Whatever he told you when he first offered for your hand, whatever cold arithmetic he believed he was making, I should not put too much faith in it representing the whole of the man, if I were you. People are frequently far worse at explaining themselves than they are at proving themselves, when it finally comes to it. She left on that, climbing into her carriage with the same unhurried authority with which she had arrived, and Eleanor stood a long while on the front step after the carriage had rounded the corner, watching the sky over Berkeley Square thicken toward the kind of low, restless gray that promised weather before nightfall, and she found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the season was ending the way it had begun. With a wound she had not asked for, and a silence she did not know how to break, except that everything underneath both of those things had shifted so entirely in the intervening months that she no longer entirely trusted her own account of what either of them meant anymore. That evening, with the first real storm of the autumn beginning to gather itself over the city in long, unhurried rolls of distant thunder, a note arrived at Eleanor's door in Julian's own hand, rather than sent through a servant, brief and uncharacteristically, without the careful formality he brought to everything else he set down on paper, asking only that she come to the study once the house had settled for the night, that there was a matter he wished to discuss with her alone, and Eleanor sat a long while with the note held loosely in her fingers, listening to the first fat drops of rain begin to strike the window pane, understanding, with a certainty that settled somewhere beneath conscious thought, that whatever was coming had been building far longer than the 6 weeks since the letter, far longer even than the 4 months since the opera, and that there would be no more formulaic bridges of time left to carry her safely past the moment now gathering itself, unhurried and inevitable as the storm outside, toward the hour when she would finally have to stand in a room alone with her husband and find out exactly what 4 years of careful silence had been keeping from her. The house had gone quiet by the time Eleanor came down the stair, the storm outside no longer gathering, but arrived in earnest, rain lashing the tall windows in long silver sheets, and thunder rolling somewhere over the river, with a sound that seemed to move through the floorboards rather than merely through the air. And she stood a moment outside the study door, with her hand not quite touching the wood, listening to nothing but her own pulse and the storm's steady percussion, before she made herself go in. Julian was standing at the window with his back to the door, no coat, his cravat already loosened in a way she had never once seen him permit in front of another living soul, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched taut between them like something that might, if handled carelessly, snap and take a hand with it. "You asked me to come," she said finally, because someone had to begin, and beginnings had never frightened her half so much as endings did. He turned from the window. The candlelight caught his face at an angle that made him look, for the first time in her memory, entirely unguarded, the careful architecture of the Duke stripped back to something raw underneath it, and when he crossed toward her, it was not in one motion, but in stages, a step, a pause as though reconsidering the whole enterprise, another step, the measured, deliberate approach of a man crossing ground he had never permitted himself to cross before and did not fully trust himself to survive crossing. "I have owed you a confession for some months," he said, "and I find I no longer have the stomach to keep postponing it in favor of a more convenient hour." The word landed between them with its full old weight, and Eleanor felt something in her chest go very still. "I heard you," she said, before he could continue, before the moment could close over the thing she had been carrying since a Tuesday in early spring. "In the library. In March. You told Ashby I would never make a scene, that I understood the terms, that this was rather the point of me. I have carried that sentence in my pocket for months, my lord, and I find I am no longer willing to set it down simply because you have grown kinder since." She had not meant to say all of it, not so plainly, not with her voice as steady as it came out, but something about the storm and the late hour and the candlelight stripping his face bare had loosened something in her as well, and she found she did not regret the words even as they hung in the air between them, immovable now, impossible to unsay. Julian did not flinch from them. He absorbed the sentence the way a man absorbs a blow he has long known was owed him, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the last of its careful authority entirely, worn down to something plainer and far more frightened than anything London had ever been permitted to hear from the Duke of Ashworth. "I said it because I was afraid of what it would mean if I admitted the opposite," he said. "I did not marry you to be spared trouble, Eleanor. I did not marry you expecting a wife who would ask nothing of me and receive nothing in return and call the arrangement a mercy. I did not marry you understanding, in any way that mattered, what I was actually purchasing, because I had trained myself for 4 years to see every transaction in this house as a column of figures and nothing more, and it was easier, God forgive me, to file you under manageable than to admit I had married the one person in my acquaintance I had never once taken the trouble to actually see. Not X, she thought, standing very still, but Y, not the cold calculation he had described to Ashby with such flat certainty, but something he had not yet found the courage to name even now, circling it the way a man circles a fire he is not certain will not burn him. "That is not an apology," she said. "It is very nearly one," he answered, and something almost like the old dry humor moved behind his eyes before vanishing again beneath the weight of what he still had left to say. "I watched you walk out of that box in front of 400 people and give none of them a single thing to feed on, and I have not, in the months since, been able to stop watching you do the same small, extraordinary thing in 100 smaller rooms. Sybil's cruelty, Cassandra's cruelty, my own, which I am under no illusion was the worst of the 3, and I began to understand, far too slowly, that the woman I had married for the sake of a ledger had a spine I had done nothing to earn, and a mind I had spent a year and a half failing to consult, and that the word convenient had never once, in all that time, applied to anything about you except my own laziness in refusing to look closer." Eleanor did not move toward him. She had promised herself, dressing that morning with the wren catching the storm gray light through her window, that whatever this conversation demanded of her, she would not surrender the whole of herself to it, simply because it had finally, belatedly arrived. She had spent a year and a half learning the cost of giving herself away for less than she was worth, and she was not prepared, even now, even with his voice stripped bare in front of her, to hand back everything at the first kind word. "I do not want to be believed in only when it is convenient to believe in me," she said. "I do not want a husband who notices me only once the alternative has become too costly to maintain. If you have come to this room tonight because the season has grown difficult and a devoted wife would be useful armor against it, I would rather you tell me so plainly and let me keep what little dignity I have left." "That is not why I asked you here," Julian said, and something in his voice, low and unhurried and entirely without its old rank behind it, made her look up at him properly for the first time since he had begun speaking. "I did not ask you here because Grantham thinks a united household plays better before the ton. I did not ask you here because my grandmother would never forgive me if I let you go on believing what I let you believe in March. I did not ask you here because there is anything at all to be gained from it, not tonight, not in this room, with no one watching and nothing to prove to anyone but you." He crossed the last of the distance between them then, close enough that she could see the unsteady rise and fall of his breath, close enough that the storm outside seemed to recede into something distant and unimportant against the small, contained weather of the room they stood in. "I asked you here," he said, "because when this house goes dark and there is no one left to perform composure for, I find I do not want to be anywhere that you are not, and I have spent a great deal of energy pretending that wanting was a weakness I could not afford, and I am tired, Eleanor, of affording it." Her hand found the wren at her collar without her quite deciding to move it there, an old habit, a small anchor against a moment too large to hold steady on its own. And she felt her throat tighten in a way she had trained herself for years not to permit in front of witnesses. "Say the true reason," she said, very quietly. "Not the ones you have already given me. The one underneath them." Julian was silent a moment, and when he answered, his voice had gone rough in a way she had never once heard from him, stripped of every last vestige of the man London feared. "Because I want you," he said, "when no one is watching. Not the wife who does not make a scene, not the arrangement that saved the estate. You, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply there in the dark of an ordinary house on an ordinary night, and I find that is the only version of wanting I have ever actually trusted, because it is the only one that costs me nothing to admit, and everything to have almost lost." The room held its breath around them, the storm outside seeming for a moment to hold its own as well, and Eleanor felt the last of her careful reserve begin, finally to give way, not in collapse but in something closer to relief, the particular loosening of a woman who has been carrying a weight so long she has forgotten what her own shoulders feel like without it. "Yes," she said, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected and warmer than she had permitted it to be in a very long time. "Because I wish it too." He did not kiss her, not yet. He took her hand instead, the plain, ordinary gesture that meant, between two people who had spent 18 months performing every other kind of intimacy the world required of them, without ever once managing this smaller, truer one, more than any grander declaration could have managed, and when Eleanor felt her eyes finally sting and overflow, she did not turn her face away or apologize for it, because the tears that came were not the tears of a woman breaking, but of a woman whose long-buried truth had simply, at last, found its way to the surface where it belonged. Julian did not let go of her hand. He held it through the whole of the storm's remaining fury, through the slow subsiding of the thunder into something more distant, through the first gray suggestion of morning beginning, hours later, to soften the black at the edges of the windows, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, because there was, for the first time in a very long marriage of careful, guarded silences, nothing left that urgently needed saying. By the time spring came fully into the Hampshire countryside, the storm that had broken over London that particular night had long since passed into ordinary memory, one weather among many, and the household it had changed had settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Julian could have predicted 18 months earlier, and neither, now, could imagine living without. Cassandra Layton had removed herself to Bath before the season's official close, her invitations thinning by careful degrees as the story of the forged ledger page circulated in the particular, unprovable, unkillable way such stories always circulate among people who have decided, quietly and without ever saying so aloud, precisely what they believe, she was said, by the following winter, to have accepted an offer from a widowed baronet of modest fortune and considerably diminished consequence, and London, characteristically, forgot her within a season, the way it forgets everyone who no longer has power enough to demand its attention. Lady Sybil remained at Ashworth Hall through the autumn, her commentary grown notably shorter, and her chair by the window notably less occupied, until even she, watching the household reorganize itself around a Duchess she had spent a year and a half underestimating, found it prudent to spend rather more of her time at her sister's house in Kent, where the arithmetic of her own irrelevance was, at least, more comfortable to bear among people who had never known her at the height of her influence. Thomas, chastened by a fortnight he never spoke of afterward without visible discomfort, settled his debts through means Eleanor did not inquire too closely into, and wrote to her more often than he ever had before. Letters that had, for the first time, rather less to do with what she might do for him than with what, however clumsily, he hoped to be for her. It was in April, on a morning bright enough to make the whole of Hampshire look freshly made, that the village school Eleanor had spent the better part of a year quietly planning, funded. In the end, not from the estate's general accounts, but from the very savings her restructured leases had produced, the £1,100 a year once credited to Mr. Bide. Prescott's cleverness, now openly and permanently attributed, on the estate's own books, to the Duchess whose arithmetic had generated it, opened its doors for the first time to the children of Ashworth's tenants, the ones whose roofs she had argued for at midnight over ledgers no one had thought to credit her for, the ones whose fathers had watched her, for a year and a half, with the same cautious, withholding doubt the rest of the world had shown her, uncertain whether a duchess married for money could possibly care what became of a cottage's leaking thatch. They had come to believe it, by inches, the way most true belief arrives, watching her walk the lanes in plain wool with mud on her hem, discussing drainage with the same unhurried attention she had once given a forged ledger's crooked sevens. And by the morning of the school's opening the green, before the new stone building was crowded 3 and 4 deep with tenants and their children, with Frances Calloway laughing somewhere near the front in a bonnet entirely too fashionable for a village green, with Thomas standing awkwardly near the back looking, for once genuinely proud of something he had not engineered, with even Prescott, restored fully to Julian's confidence once the truth of the ledgers had settled into the household's ordinary understanding. Watching from beside the door with an expression that suggested he, too, had finally stopped mistaking quiet competence for something smaller than it was. Above the school's entrance, carved into the lintel stone at Julian's own insistence, and against Eleanor's soft, embarrassed protest, sat a small wren in relief, wings spread. And beneath it a single line cut deep enough to outlast every one of them. It sings because it can. Julian stood before the assembled crowd in the ordinary coat of a man come to open a school rather than the formal dress of a duke performing consequence, and when the murmur of the gathering settled into the particular hush a crowd offers only when it senses something worth actually hearing. He did not begin with the practiced, generous nothing such occasions usually demanded of men in his position. "Most of you," he said, his voice carrying easily across the green in the low, unhurried register that had once made rooms fall silent from fear, and now, increasingly, made them fall silent from something closer to respect. "Remember the season 2 years past when it was widely understood in London that I had married for convenience, and that my wife, whatever her private qualities, would prove precisely as much use to this estate as her dowry, and no more. I remember it too. I believed a version of it myself, for longer than I am proud to admit, and I stand here today to tell you. In front of every tenant whose roof she argued for, and every child who will learn their letters under a roof her own arithmetic paid for, that we were wrong." The crowd did not laugh, though there was, in its collective stillness, something warmer than laughter, an attentiveness that had gathered itself around him the way a room gathers around a truth it has been waiting to hear confirmed aloud. "She has never once asked for credit for anything she has done in this house," Julian went on, "not for the leases that kept a dozen families in their cottages through a hard winter, not for the ledgers that saved this estate more than a steward twice her salary ever managed, not for the composure she showed the whole of London on a night I am not especially proud of, and which most of you, I suspect, remember rather better than I would like. She has patience enough to outweigh cruelty without ever once returning it in kind. She has precision enough to catch a forger's crooked hand in the very columns meant to ruin her. And she has a courage that asks for no audience at all, which is, I have come to believe, the rarest and truest kind there is. He paused there, and the green held itself very still around him, waiting. I do not know how long it will take this country to stop measuring a woman's worth by the size of the fortune that bought her a title, he said. But I know that whatever this school teaches the children gathered here today, I would like them to learn it first. That a person's value has very little to do with how loudly the world insists on announcing it, and everything to do with what she quietly, patiently, does with the years no one thought to watch. My wife was never convenient. She was, from the very first morning I failed to notice it, the single most valuable thing this house has ever possessed, and I intend to spend whatever years remain to me making up the difference between what she was owed and what I gave her. The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory ripple of a crowd performing enthusiasm for a duke's benefit. It rose instead in a genuine, swelling wave from the tenants nearest the front, spreading back through the green until even the children, sensing rather than understanding the occasion's full weight, added their own uneven, delighted noise to it. And Eleanor, standing beside her husband with her mother's wren catching the bright spring light at her collar, felt the tears rise again, unbidden and unashamed, the same clean, surfacing kind she had allowed herself once before in a storm-lit study and had learned, since, were nothing at all to hide from. Frances found her afterward, near the school's freshly painted door, and took both her hands with the particular fierce affection of a friend who has waited a long while to say something she now finally could. You let yourself want something out loud, in the end, she said, laughing and half crying herself. I told you that you would have to. Eventually, I did not do it alone, Eleanor said, and found, saying it, that the admission cost her nothing at all anymore. That evening, once the green had emptied, and the last of the tenants' laughter had faded into the ordinary contentment of a village settling toward dusk, Eleanor and Julian walked the lane back toward the hall together, unhurried, his hand finding hers somewhere along the way without either of them remarking on it. The way the truest gestures rarely need remarking on at all. The sky ahead of them had cleared entirely, the last low bank of gray cloud breaking apart over the western hills into long streaks of gold, and Eleanor thought, walking beside him with the wren warm beneath her fingers where she had touched it once more out of old habit, that her mother had been right about a great many things she had not lived long enough to prove, and that the proof, when it finally arrived, had taken far longer and cost far more than an 8-year-old girl pinning a tin brooch to her collar could ever have imagined it would. It was not a perfect marriage even now, and she did not expect it to become one merely because a storm had broken and a school had opened and a crowd had finally said aloud what she had spent a year and a half hoping someone, anyone, might one day think to say. It was not easy, and she suspected there would be difficult seasons ahead that no single confession, however sincere, could fully guard against. But it was, at long last, shared. The ledgers, the doubts, the quiet inheritance of a woman who had taught her daughter that singing never required an audience. The whole slow architecture of two guarded people learning, by degrees too small for either of them to have noticed committing to, how to be seen by each other without flinching from it. And as the last of the storm's gray retreated fully behind them, and the first true light of the new day gathered itself gold and steady over the fields ahead, Eleanor understood, with a certainty that asked nothing further of her, that not perfect and not easy had never been the standard she needed to hold her life against. Simply shared was more than enough. More, in fact, than she had ever quite let herself believe she was owed, and she tightened her fingers once around her husband's hand, and he did not let go, and together, saying nothing further, because nothing further needed saying. They walked on toward the house that had finally, truly become theirs.